Jake had worked night maintenance at the Meridian office complex for 3 years. He knew every squeaky floorboard, every flickering light, every corner where the cleaning supplies gathered dust. So when he stepped out of the elevator on the 14th floor and found himself in a corridor that stretched impossibly far in both directions, lined with identical beige doors, his first thought wasn't terror, it was confusion. The hallway looked like every other hallway in the building, except it was wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed with that familiar industrial drone, but they seemed to go on forever. The carpet was the same commercial-grade blue with those little geometric patterns, but it stretched beyond where his flashlight beam could reach. And the smell, that perpetual mixture of cleaning chemicals and recycled air, was stronger here, almost suffocating. Jake pulled out his phone. No signal. The time read 2:47 a.m., but something felt off about even that. He'd entered the elevator at 2:45 a.m. to check a reported water leak on 14. 2 minutes couldn't account for this. He tried the nearest door. Locked. The next one. Locked. They all had the same brass nameplate holder, but no names. Just empty frames catching the harsh fluorescent light. Hello? His voice echoed strangely, as if the corridor absorbed and reflected it back wrong. Security? Anyone? The only response was the electrical hum above and the soft whisper of ventilation that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Jake decided to walk. One direction was as good as another. His footsteps made no sound on the carpet, which disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. He'd walked these same floors for years. He knew they creaked, knew they had substance. This felt like walking on nothing. After what felt like 20 minutes, he reached a corner. The corridor turned left, revealing another identical stretch. Same doors, same lights, same carpet. But now he noticed something else. Wet footprints on the floor. His own, he realized. But they were behind him, and he'd been walking straight. That was when Jake understood he was no longer in the Meridian office complex. He was somewhere else entirely. He walked faster now, trying doors with increasing desperation. Behind one, he heard something. A soft scratching, like fingernails on wood. Behind another, a whisper that might have been his name. When he pressed his ear to the third door, he heard nothing but the sound of his own breathing, amplified and distorted. The corridor began to change. The fluorescent lights flickered more frequently, casting moving shadows that seemed to follow him. The carpet developed stains, dark spots that looked suspiciously like old blood. Some of the doors stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms filled with broken office furniture and yellowed papers scattered across moldy floors. Jake's watch now read 2:47 a.m. Still, as if time itself had stopped in this place. He found a stairwell, its metal steps echoing with each footfall. Down one flight, 2 flights, 3. Each landing led to another corridor identical to the one above. The emergency exit signs glowed their familiar green, but the arrows pointed in directions that made no geometric sense. On the 7th floor down, or was it the 7th floor up, Jake encountered his first entity. It stood at the far end of the corridor, perfectly still. At first, he thought it was a person in a maintenance uniform like his own, but as he approached, calling out, he realized the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung past its knees. When it turned to face him, Jake saw that it had no face at all, just smooth skin where features should have been. Jake ran. His feet pounded against carpet that felt increasingly soft, increasingly wrong. Behind him, he heard the entity following, its footsteps making no sound, but somehow conveying inexorable pursuit. He threw himself through the first unlocked door he found. The room was his apartment, every detail perfect. His couch, his TV, his kitchen table with yesterday's mail still scattered across it. But the windows showed only yellow light, and beyond them, the sound of fluorescent humming. Jake sank into his familiar chair and pulled out his phone. 2:47 a.m. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone, anyone to call. But all the names were wrong. People he'd never met. Numbers he'd never dialed. The photos showed faces that were almost familiar, but not quite right, like memories of memories. Outside his false apartment, in the corridor that had no end, Jake heard doors opening and closing, footsteps that made no sound, and always the humming of lights that would never turn off. He looked at his watch. 2:47 a.m. He would look at it again in what felt like hours. 2:47 a.m. Time had stopped in the back rooms, but Jake continued to age. He could feel it in his bones, in the growing weight of this endless moment. Somewhere in the distance, the faceless entity in the maintenance uniform waited patiently for him to emerge, because eventually he would have to leave his false apartment. The back rooms would make sure of that. Emma had always been a strong swimmer. At 12, she'd won her first medal. At 16, she'd broken her high school's freestyle record. At 22, she was training for nationals when she made the mistake that would change everything. The university's pool complex was supposed to be closed for maintenance, but Emma had a key. She'd done this before, sneaking in for late-night training sessions when the crowds were gone and the water was still. She slipped through the side entrance, changed in the dark locker room, and padded barefoot across the familiar tiles. But when she pushed through the double doors to the pool area, she stopped dead. The pool stretched endlessly in both directions, its surface reflecting the sickly yellow glow of fluorescent lights that lined the ceiling in perfect rows. The familiar chemical smell of chlorine was overwhelming here, burning her nostrils and making her eyes water. The walls were covered in those same white tiles she knew so well, but they continued far beyond where the pool area should have ended. Emma stood at the pool's edge, looking down into water that seemed both crystal clear and impossibly deep. She could see the bottom, the same familiar blue paint with lane markers, but it looked miles away. When she called out, her voice echoed strangely, bouncing off walls that were too far away to see. The diving board was there, jutting out over the water like a challenge. Without thinking, Emma climbed up. From the board's height, she could see that the pool had no end in either direction. It was like looking down a liquid hallway, perfectly straight, lined with lane ropes that disappeared into the distance. She dove. The water was exactly the right temperature, that perfect balance between cool and warm that made her feel weightless. But as she began to swim, Emma realized something was wrong. She was fast, faster than she'd ever been, but the walls never seemed to get closer. She swam a perfect freestyle stroke, breathing every third pull, but the lane markers on the bottom never changed. She stopped and treaded water, looking around. The pool stretched in all directions now, not just forward and back. The starting blocks were gone. The diving board was gone. There was only water, endless water, under those humming fluorescent lights. Emma tried to swim back to where she'd entered, but there was no back. There was no forward. There was only the eternal present of swimming in place while the lane markers mocked her below. She floated on her back, staring up at the lights. They were arranged in perfect rows, each one exactly the same distance from the next. The ceiling was too high to see clearly, lost in the yellow glow. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the lights burned into her retinas. That's when she heard the splashing. Someone else was in the pool. Emma called out, but got no response. The splashing continued. Not the rhythmic sound of swimming, but something more erratic, desperate. She swam toward the sound, her strokes powerful and sure, but it seemed to move away from her at the same speed she approached. The water began to change. It was still clear, still the perfect temperature, but now it tasted different. Not like chlorine anymore, but like something organic, something that had been sitting stagnant for too long. Emma tried not to think about what might be growing in water that never circulated, never emptied, never cleaned. She swam for what felt like hours, chasing the sound of splashing that stayed always just out of reach. Her muscles didn't tire. They couldn't hear, but her mind began to fray. The endless repetition of stroke, breathe became a meditation on her own helplessness. When she finally saw the other swimmer, Emma wished she hadn't. It was herself, or something wearing her face. The other, Emma floated motionless in the water, face down, arms spread wide. But as Emma approached, the figure began to move, its head turning with movements that looked wrong underwater. Its eyes were open, staring, and its mouth moved as if trying to speak. Emma tried to scream, but only bubbles came out. She was underwater now, though she couldn't remember diving. The other Emma reached for her with fingers that were too long, too pale, webbed with something that might have been skin or might have been something else entirely. Above them, the lights continued their endless humming, casting wavering shadows through the water. Emma looked up and saw more figures floating near the surface, dozens of them, all wearing faces she recognized. Her teammates, her coaches, her family, all floating motionless in the endless pool. She tried to swim up, but the surface seemed to move away from her. The water grew thicker, more resistant. Her lungs burned, but she couldn't reach air. Below her, the other Emma smiled and pointed downward, toward the depths that went on forever. Emma understood then that she had become part of the pool, another floating figure for the next swimmer to find. The water filled her lungs, but she didn't die. She couldn't die. She could only float and wait and listen to the endless humming of lights that would never turn off. In the distance, she heard the sound of someone diving in. Marcus had worked at Food Mart for 8 months, and he thought he knew every corner of the store. The fluorescent lit aisles, the walk-in freezer that always ran too cold, the break room with its perpetually broken coffee machine. He knew which floorboards creaked, which lights flickered, which security cameras actually worked. So when he came in for his closing shift and found aisle 7 stretching impossibly into the distance, his first instinct was to assume someone was playing a prank. "Very funny," he called out, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the endless rows of shelves. The aisle looked exactly like every other aisle in the store. White linoleum floor, fluorescent lights humming overhead, metal shelving units stocked with identical products. But it went on forever, disappearing into a yellow haze that hurt to look at directly. Marcus pulled out his phone to call his manager, but there was no signal. The store's overhead music, that same playlist of generic pop and easy listening that drove him crazy during normal shifts, continued to play, but it sounded different here. Distant and distorted, like it was coming from underwater. He started walking down the aisle, his footsteps echoing strangely. The products on the shelves were familiar. Boxes of cereal, canned goods, household items. But something was off about them. The labels were slightly wrong, the colors too bright or too dull. A box of cornflakes had an expiration date of February 30th. A can of soup listed ingredients that didn't exist. After what felt like 10 minutes of walking, Marcus reached for his phone again. No signal, and the time display showed 11:47 p.m. But that was impossible. He'd started his shift at 11 p.m., and he'd been walking for longer than that. He tried to turn around, but the aisles stretched endlessly in both directions now. Behind him, the path back to the front of the store had disappeared into the same yellow haze. The fluorescent lights above hummed their familiar tune, but louder now, more insistent. Marcus began to run. His sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as he passed shelf after shelf of wrong products. Toothpaste that promised to clean your soul. Breakfast cereal made from dreams. Milk that never spoiled because it was never real to begin with. The store's background music grew louder, more distorted. He could make out fragments of songs he recognized, but they were wrong. The lyrics changed, the melodies twisted into something that made his teeth ache. A love song became a warning. A cheerful jingle became a funeral dirge. He found the first body at what might have been the 20-minute mark of his endless walk. A Food Mart employee slumped against the shelving unit, wearing the same red vest that Marcus wore. The name tag read Marcus, but the face was unfamiliar. The employee's eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was full of sawdust that had spilled from a torn bag of pet bedding. Marcus backed away, but found another body 10 feet down the aisle. This one was also wearing his name tag, also had his face, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that reached almost to the floor. This version of Marcus was restocking shelves with meticulous care, placing each item in perfect alignment, but his movements were too slow, too deliberate, like a record playing at the wrong speed. The tall Marcus turned to look at him, and Marcus saw that his eyes were the fluorescent lights, bright, buzzing, casting shadows that moved independently of his body. "Clean up on aisle 7, the tall Marcus said, his voice coming from the overhead speakers instead of his mouth. "Clean up on aisle 7. Marcus ran faster now, past more versions of himself. One was operating a register that had no customers, scanning items that dissolved in his hands. Another was mopping the floor with water that left everything dirtier than before. A third was eating from a box of cereal that refilled itself, his jaw moving mechanically as sawdust spilled from his mouth. The store's music reached a crescendo of wrongness, every song playing at once, layered and distorted until it became pure noise. Marcus covered his ears, but the sound came from inside his head now, from the lights, from the walls themselves. He found the exit at the end of the aisle, but when he burst through the doors, he found himself back in aisle 7. The same endless stretch of shelves, the same yellow haze, the same humming lights. A new Marcus was already there, just beginning his shift, looking around in confusion at the impossible length of the aisle. He watched his newest self pull out a phone, see no signal, start walking down the aisle with the same determined expression he remembered having. Marcus understood then that he was trapped in the store's closing routine, doomed to repeat his shift forever. But he also understood that each time he forgot a little more. Soon, he would be like the other Marcuses, restocking shelves with mechanical precision, mopping floors that would never be clean, scanning items that didn't exist. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention shoppers, the store is now closed. Please make your way to the nearest exit." But there was no exit. There was only the endless aisle, the humming lights, and the knowledge that somewhere, another Marcus was just beginning his shift, walking into a store that had no end. Marcus picked up a box of cereal from the shelf, Eternal Loops, now with more yesterday, and began to eat. The sawdust tasted like every closing shift he'd ever worked, like every fluorescent light he'd ever worked under, like every moment he'd ever spent wishing he was somewhere else. Now he was somewhere else, and he would never leave.